Tales Under a Broken Sky, Episode 15, The Forest of the Red Wolf. James Stanley was cold, tired, and more than a little bit afraid. Pausing to catch his breath, he stared around nervously, eyes lingering on the deep winter shadows cast by the pale November moon. He shivered, the wind biting into the exposed skin of his face and slowly seeping through his fleece-lined jacket. But the chill went deeper than that. A slow trembling was building in his bones, resonating in time with his racing heart. I shouldn't be here. He was no longer feeling too sure of himself. He stifled a sneeze and wiped the gloved hand across his nose. His hands were shaking. He tightened his grip on the rifle and told himself that it was just a cold. James knew that it wasn't. He was beginning to lose his nerve. There was plenty of it to go around earlier, down in Sullivan's. It wasn't hard to be brave when you were sitting in the warm, smoky interior of a pub with a beer in your hand and an empty whiskey glass on the bar. It was easy to say that you could face down a wolf out in the old forest that night. It had been shockingly easy to claim that you would actually do it, and to his lingering surprise, even easier to place a bet worth most of your month's salary with the richest man in town. It was as much a surprise to him as it was to the rest of the patrons. Bragging was his thing. Everyone knew that. Everyone also knew that he didn't have it in him to back up any of his claims, James included. Looking back now, James couldn't understand how he had ever let himself get caught up in the moment. Perhaps it had been the beer, or the whiskey, or maybe just sheer spite. Whatever the reason, when Stephen Weber drunkenly offered 500 cash to anyone who could provide proof of the elusive red wolf of the forest, something inside James had snapped. Listening to that entitled asshole prattle on all evening, the subtle jibes directed at his grandfather, and the not-so-subtle snickering laughter directed at him, had been bad enough. But the arrogant, mocking tone with which Stephen had declared the offer struck a nerve. James had drained his glass and accepted the offer with surprising speed, a speed that he was now deeply regretting. Slamming his glass down and standing, barely aware of the hush that had fallen over the previously boisterous atmosphere, James had approached Stephen's table, his blood hot from a cocktail of alcohol, anger, and sheer dislike of the man. He had accepted the challenge, and then, not wanting to be outdone by that pretentious prick, had upped the ante, boldly claiming that if he couldn't bring back proof, he would give Stephen 500 himself. A heavy weight settled in James's gut at the mingled look of disdain and triumph that had flashed across Stephen's face. Had he been played? Stephen had a vicious poker face and was an old hand at screwing money out of people. Most of his success was built on those two traits. He knew people. More importantly, he knew people's weaknesses, and especially pertinent at that moment, he knew James Stanley's. James had worked for him for years, a low-level job at one of his stores. He was well aware that Stephen knew he had a big mouth and a limited capacity for action. He knew that Stephen had often seen him bragging, only to pull back before he got in too deep. In short, Stephen had pushed all of his buttons, and he was screwed. The wager was worth almost an entire week of his wages. But for Stephen, It was pocket money, and they both knew it. They shook on the deal. James desperately searched the other man's face for a sign of guilt, or even the vaguest suggestion that he might let him off. But all he saw was that cocky smile and a slightly raised eyebrow, daring him to back down. He grabbed his coat from the stool and left without saying another word. James looked around into the shadows again. Something rustled the undergrowth to his left, and he spun, swinging the flashlight, shadows dancing wildly. Another twig snapped somewhere behind him, and his breath caught. Damn it. I'm not going to start having second thoughts now. He tightened his grip on the rifle, trying to quell the shaking in his hands. No, not this time. He trained his flashlight on the path ahead, the narrow beam struggling to penetrate the gaping maw formed by the overhanging branches of the ancient trees. The night warped around him, stretching and contracting around the dense emptiness of the shadows. He shuddered again. Looks like I rightly fucked up this time. He trailed off as a distant howl drifted to his ears. He jerked up, back rigid with fear and panic at the sound. I can still go back, he assured himself slowly. I can still go back. A muscle spasmed in his forearm, and he looked down in surprise to see the death grip he had on the weapon. Forcing himself to relax his grip, he winced at the protestations of his stiff fingers. Is it really worth this? Is that mangy red dog really worth all of this? But he already knew the answer. Damn it. You haven't left yourself any options here, James. He forced himself to take a step forward, whispering savagely to himself as he moved, trying to find the earlier anger that had led him astray. Come on, James. Come on, James. Come on. There ain't no ginger mutt going to get the better of you. The dry leaves underfoot crackled sharply as he trudged forward into the darkness. I've had nothing but trouble since the day my grandfather shot that goddamn wolf. He found that the muttering helped, the steady stream of consciousness chatter breaking up the pervasive silence of the woods. I wasn't even alive then. Why should I have to carry that damn burden on my back? Just because he saw one of them, just because he got a shot off. They all thought him mad, but he didn't care, did he? Running his mouth off in bars to anyone that would listen. Wasn't thinking about what it would do to him, or Dad, or me. Those damn wolves. James didn't believe those stories himself. They were the Yeti, the Loch Ness monster of local folklore. His entire life, he had been subjected to the stories of how his grandfather had found and tracked one, wounded it, even, in one version of the story. And there were many versions of that story. His grandfather never had any physical evidence to back up his assertions. He had always claimed, when the mood was on him to tell that story, that the wolf had faded away before his eyes, without a trace, no blood, no fur, no tracks, just there one moment and gone the next. And while some people had believed him, the vast majority had quickly tired of his animated retellings and dismissed his claims. James's father had never believed the stories, and neither did James. But that didn't stop his grandfather's particular brand of madness tormenting them across generations. It had always made James an easy mark with his peers, and his classmates had dubbed him Wolf Boy from day one. An appellation that had proved difficult to shift, especially when one of those classmates was Stephen Weber. He felt even more bitter to those in the town who had egged his grandfather on, coaxing him into retelling his story at every opportunity. They had all laughed, behind the man's back, of course, but his grandfather had lapped up the attention. He'd told that story up until the day he died. Towards the end, he forgot his own, his son's, and James's names more often than not. But he never forgot that damn story. The week before he died, he had even been interviewed by a streaming network for a show on unexplained phenomena and strange creatures. Now the man's lunacy was on the internet for everyone to see. A branch snapped in the shadows and James jumped. He didn't believe his grandfather's story, but that didn't stop him trembling at the thought of a vicious 200-pound blood-red wolf stalking him through the forest. His cynicism didn't protect him from the terror he felt at the thought of facing down the admittedly fairy tale beast, with the very fires of hell burning in its eyes, as his grandfather had put it. "I'm scaring myself now," he shivered. "I've never believed those stories before. So why, in the name of the fucking Three Stooges, do I start believing them now? Come on, James, you know better than that." But he didn't feel comforted. He felt even worse. The soft whisper of his voice was magnified in the still night air, echoing through the deep silence of the forest. A sudden feeling of deep loneliness pinched his heart. James felt like he was the only one left in the world. The forest was terrifyingly still around him. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snapping twig, even his own footsteps, were amplified and attenuated by that silence, contorted into ghastly caricatures of the original sounds. James stopped at the top of a short rise and stood trembling, a petrifying fear sweeping over him. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. His rising blood pressure throbbed uncomfortably in his temples. In a moment of stark realization, it suddenly seemed to him as if he were a million miles away from the bright and warm public house where he had earlier more or less signed his life away. He couldn't be much more than a few hundred yards into the forest, but that short distance didn't mean much now. Another twig snapped, nearer now. It echoed through the forest like a gunshot. James jumped, and the gun shook in his hands as he sighted down the barrel and nervously scanned the shadows. God, how am I meant to shoot the thing if I can't even hold a bloody gun straight? He thought dismally. Some hunter I am. I'm scared of my own bloody shadow. James shuffled awkwardly in a circle. Nothing was visible beyond the narrow cone of his flashlight. The world disappeared off into the unknowable void of the night. When the distant echoes of movement faded, the heavy silence settled over James's shoulders again. He was suddenly painfully aware of how small he was in the grand scheme of things. For a fleeting instant, he reached a complete understanding of the vastness of the world, and the forest seemed to grow, stretching outwards and upwards, swelling as if it had just comprehended its own immensity. But even that paled in comparison to the world on a grand scale, a world that held everything he could conceive of in his limited experience of it. Millions, billions of people, all with their own private, internal world, living, loving, laughing, and dying. He shuddered in awe at the thought. Then, that moment of clarity came crashing down on him in a catastrophic, claustrophobic wave. The vision of that infinitely complex and amorphous world disintegrated, and he was alone again, isolated from everything and everyone he had ever known. His past and future smeared across an event horizon intimated by the limits of his flashlight. There was nothing else, just him, the forest, and the shadows. There was never anything else. There would never be anything else. His entire existence had become compressed into that one moment. His glances around the clearing became more erratic now. Awkward, jerking motions that set the shadows dancing. Paranoia seized him, and the world spun, expanding and contracting in nauseating discord. James's movements became desynchronized, his torch leading and trailing the path of his eyes, the world becoming a series of flashing images, disconnected from one another. He heard another twig snap, then another, and another, each one getting closer, echoing around his tiny bubble of safety from all sides. The sounds filled his head in a resonant cacophony, interrupted his thoughts, and sabotaged the last vestiges of reason. The feeling of paranoia peaked, and he no longer cared about anything. Not his money, not the wolf, not even proving, once and for all, that his grandfather had been a liar. All that mattered now was the rapidly encroaching sound of impending doom. Another snap came from behind him, and he broke. Before James realized what was happening, he was running on adrenaline-fueled legs along the path. The torch in his hand bounced unevenly along the trail. Elongated shadows of trees and branches reached from the gloom, grabbing and trying to trip him up. He ran blindly, pure terror propelling him forward. He couldn't look back. The raised hairs on his neck told him what he would see. Looking back was a death sentence, and he knew it. His legs carried him to a small clearing, about a mile from where he had parked his pickup before they gave out from under him. Half blinded by the rhythmic strobing of the bouncing light, his foot caught on a thick root protruding from the earth. He landed hard, knocking the breath from his lungs and causing the world to oscillate wildly. Nausea gripped his stomach, and he vomited violently into a pile of rotting leaves. Completely spent, James lay shuddering on the frozen ground, drifting in and out of conscious thought. That's it. I'm gonna die here, lying in a pool of my own vomit. Will they find me? Will they even care to look? Will that asshole even feel bad? James closed his eyes and waited for the end. The next hour was lost in a delirium of snot, tears, fear, and bone-deep shivering. It could have been minutes, or hours, or years, before he finally managed to regain control of his senses. When at last, he finally managed to struggle to his feet, his legs were weak and collapsed under him almost as soon as they took his weight. Sitting sprawled in a mess of damp leaves and twigs, he began to laugh uncontrollably. At first, the sound wasn't much different from his usual laugh, but as it continued, it took on a desperate edge, slipping higher in pitch until it felt like there was no room inside him for anything but the hysteria, not even his earlier fear. Forgetting himself, he roared into the night and laughed even harder at the distant, chastising echo. Oh Lord, I was running from nothing. He collapsed backwards, rolling from side to side, wrapping his arms tightly around himself. He laughed until his sides began to cramp. He laughed until tears began to stream down his face. He laughed until he heard the growling. All traces of the mania fled his body at the deep, guttural sound emanating from the undergrowth, not 10 yards from where he sat. Breathing hard, James staggered to his feet, awkwardly fumbling for the rifle as he stood. He propped it against his shoulder and thumbed the safety as he leveled it in the direction of the noise. Some use this is... I can't even hold the goddamn gun straight. He trembled, uncertain if he could even aim, let alone pull the trigger if the wolf emerged. A bush at the edge of the clearing rustled. A twig snapped off to his right. Some long grass to his left swayed in a way that seemed unnatural. Something growled behind him. He turned slowly, half expecting to see the wolf bounding towards him. But when he turned, there was nothing there. Something snapped in the direction he had just turned from. Then again, and again, until the sounds blended together into the crunching of dried bone. They're drawn closer. James turned back around slowly, afraid of what he might see. Peering down the bead of his rifle, he saw the bush beginning to part down the middle. He saw the wolf's muzzle appear first, a dark, glistening nose surrounded by deep, crimson fur, the nostrils dilating as it sniffed the air. Slowly, the rest of the wolf's head emerged from the bush, its amber eyes bright and unblinking, staring at James back down the barrel of his gun. All of the fight left him at that moment, and the hand holding the rifle fell limply to his side. He watched in terrified awe as the beast emerged fully from the bush and stepped into the narrow circle of light cast by his discarded flashlight. The wolf's crimson pelt, gleaming in the yellow light, appeared as if it was on fire. Fuck, he's massive! James's voice narrowed to a weak, terrified whisper. He watched, mesmerized, as the wolf stalked around him in a wide circle, fur rippling with the fluid movements of its muscles. The beast looked dangerous, but it kept its distance, eyeing the gun warily. The wolf stopped and howled. James couldn't look away. He was mesmerized by the bright amber eyes. The wolf looked back at him, staring him down. Silence crept over the clearing again. Time stretched out as the two sets of eyes remained locked across the short expanse. James could feel the pulse throbbing in his temple, beating fast over a deepening pressure in his head. His breath was shallow, each quick gasp of air tearing at the back of his already raw throat. I'm like a bloody trap rabbit. A little, helpless bloody rabbit. His head was buzzing, and the edge of his vision was beginning to darken. Well, at least I didn't lose the bet. Somehow, the brief flash of gallows humor broke through the trance. Without thinking, he raised the rifle back to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. He had forgotten how quiet the forest had been until the gunshot rang out, almost deafening him. His eyes squeezed closed reflexively at the ringing in his ears. When he finally managed to pry them open, the wolf was gone. Where are you gone, you red-coated son of a bitch? His grandfather's story rushed back to him. The wolf just vanished. All of his doubts about the veracity of his grandfather's claims were gone, swallowed up by a steadily expanding hole in his gut. Fear and shame rushed in to take their place. Unwilling to find out what had happened, James scooped his torch from the ground and started to run back down the trail. He flinched at a sound from the undergrowth, and somewhere nearby, the wolf howled again. James's blood ran cold. He forced his failing legs to run, pounding unsteadily back along the path. Shit, I can't outrun a bloody wolf. His heavy strides sent painful vibrations through his shins and up the back of his legs. He could hear the wolf gaining on him with every step. He could feel the hot breath on the back of his neck, his nerves prickling as he envisioned the long incisors sinking into his flesh. His shoulders tensed at the feeling of paws clawing at him, tearing through his clothes and mauling his back. He didn't dare look back over his shoulder, so he didn't see the awkward, off-kilter gait of the wolf that was chasing him, or the way it was favoring one foreleg over the other. James was so caught up in his fear that he didn't notice when the wolf turned away altogether and slipped back into the trees, limping painfully into the shadows. He didn't notice he was alone until he reached the tree line and slammed into the side of his pickup, groping blindly for the door handle in terror. It wasn't until he dropped his keys, clinking loudly in the once again still forest, that he realized he was alone. He slumped into the driver's seat, relief and confusion battling for supremacy as he struggled to get his breathing and emotions under control. Thank you, 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 thank you. His words were a repeated refrain as he pulled the cross from around his neck and kissed the sweat-damp metal. Gathering himself, he turned the key in the ignition. The engine wouldn't catch. Outside the car, a chorus of wolves howling erupted in the distance. I don't care how far that goddamn wolf is. I want out of here. He turned the key again, and the engine stuttered into life. I owe that creep 500. He thought glumly as he sped down the road towards the town again. Damn you, damn you, damn you! But his last curse was cut short. He was about a mile from the bar when he hit a patch of ice on the road. James fought desperately with the wheel, trying to get it back under control, but the pickup skidded and struck a tree side-on, buckling the passenger side door. James's knee clattered into the bottom of the dashboard. His seatbelt, the one thing about his pickup that he never neglected, dug into his chest as it stopped him flying through the windscreen. He was slammed back into the seat and coughed harshly as the breath was forced from his lungs. Damn it! He yelled angrily, slamming his hands against the dashboard in frustration. Damn you! Damn you, you mangy mutt! What did I ever do to deserve this? James pushed open the door roughly and pulled himself out of the car. His left knee buckled under him as his foot hit the ground. He grunted in pain and leaned back against the door. There was a gash on his thigh, just above the knee. Groaning, he worked his way around to the front. Steam was rising from underneath the bonnet. Oh, shit. He brought his fist down in frustration, leaving a dent in the thin metal. Not that it matters much anyway, this thing's a bloody wreck. Fuck! James stood panting at the side of the road, struggling to regain his composure. Better start walking. This thing isn't going anywhere soon. He started limping along the road. At least I'm not far from the bar. He smiled to himself. I still have some of that poker money left. Maybe just enough to make me forget about this whole thing. It was past midnight, when he finally arrived back at the bar and stumbled gratefully through the door. No one spoke to him as he crossed a room and climbed stiffly onto a stool at the bar. He signaled to the bartender to bring him a beer, and he gulped it down, relishing the feel of the cold liquid against his raw throat. Ordering another drink, he turned to the others, who had begun to gather round him in curiosity. James looked down at his clothes, at the mud, fragments of leaves, and the dried blood staining the rip in his pants. Maybe I can salvage something from the situation after all. What happened up there, James? Stephen asked, curiosity jostling with concern in his voice. It had been a great relief to him that James had come back alive. He had been worried about it all night. He didn't want the man's blood on his hands. Not even his lucrative winning streak at the poker table had taken his mind off it. Now that James was back, and clearly still alive, he felt a bit less guilty for wanting to know the result of their earlier wager. James smiled inwardly and gave a quick glance upwards before he started to tell his story. Maybe things hadn't happened at all differently for him all those years ago. Perhaps he had even been onto something. The old man hadn't paid for a drink in his life after he came back with that story, even if almost everyone thought he was crazy. Well, lads, here's what happened. Welcome, folks, to episode 15 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I'm your host, Keith, and I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. In terms of content so far on this show, the story in this episode is ancient. I wrote the original story so long ago, I can't even remember when it was, just that it's been sitting in my editing pile for years, waiting for the time that I finally got back to it and give it the polish and finish that I wanted. In that time, I think, this story has probably undergone 2 to 3 rewrites before I finally sat down last month to start working on what I hoped was the final revision. One of the things that I noticed during this process was how much my writing style has changed over the years, or even just over the last 8 months since I started this podcast. I used to write in lots of longish paragraphs and hadn't really established any personal conventions or style for things like dialogue, unspoken thoughts, or character interactions. This is probably a rather long way of saying that it was kind of a mess, especially from the perspective of something that I was going to eventually script and record. That said, even before I started to record these stories, I was beginning to lean towards a much shorter and snappier paragraph style. But the amount of writing and editing I had done over the past year has helped to consolidate these stylistic changes completely. As I mentioned back in episode 0, one of the motivations behind starting Tales Under a Broken Sky was to help me build a more consistent practice, both in my writing and editing, and to push me to finishing something every few weeks, be that a short story, a chapter of a longer piece, or maybe even just digging a bit deeper into a piece of writing that had caught hold of me, and revisiting some of my old favourites. Over the past 8 months or so, I can honestly say I've written, edited and produced more than I have in a couple of years. So, mission accomplished there. Revisiting this older piece certainly got me to take stock of the progression and improvements in my writing, which can often fly under the radar while my head is stuck trying to get a piece finished and out the door. It was a nice change in pace and took me longer to finish than I initially planned, forcing some changes in the planned running order I had, but was extremely satisfying in the end. This particular story is admittedly not very deep. I wanted to do a kind of haunted forest story and include some kind of mythological creature of one kind or another, without going down a cryptozoological rabbit hole. Too much so anyway. The overall idea I had was the protagonist makes a rash decision, regrets this almost immediately, ends up in trouble, and eventually changes their mind about their motivations. In this story, the protagonist is resentful of his grandfather and all the tall tales he used to tell. But after his encounter with the wolf in the forest, comes to the realization that it may have all been an act in the first place, and then proceeds to use his own experiences to his advantage, in much the same way. Storytelling is a powerful thing. How many myths, urban legends, conspiracy theories and rumours have been started by someone flippantly saying something, and then, for one reason or another, not backing down from what they've said, before it gathered enough steam to take on a life of its own. In the past, this would have been word of mouth retelling, stories told by campfires, in chairs by the hearth, or in smoky bars. Nowadays, stories and rumours can spread like wildfire across the internet and social media, taking on a life of their own much more quickly and in a much more widespread manner than they could before. And once they are out there, it is impossible to reel those things back in. And in the current era, when you never really know the person you are hearing the story from, separating fact from fiction, identifying their motivations, and untangling the web of political propaganda is a monumental task. Until next time. Thank you for listening to episode 15 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I hope you enjoyed this week's production as much as I enjoyed writing and recording it. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing to the podcast on your platform of choice and leaving a rating and/or review. Thank you again for your time. Stay tuned to hear a brief trailer for the next episode. Tales Under a Broken Sky, Episode 16, A Deal with the Devil. Mark Winthrop was lazy, but describing him as lazy really only touches on the surface of his personality. He could also, and quite rightfully so, be described as selfish, opportunistic, self-absorbed, envious, or petty, although he would never have used any of those labels to describe himself. Unemployed by choice, although there was a long string of rejections to the contrary. He spent his days prowling the streets, checking payphones for forgotten change, gutters for dropped coins, notes and wallets, and chancing his arm with lost receipts from bus station luggage drops. Sometimes, if his luck was really in, he would chance upon a misplaced handbag, wedding ring, nice watch, or some other similar item of great sentimental and monetary value. On those days, Mark would add nearby police stations and public notice boards to his daily route. He would spend hours sifting through the detritus of handyman posters, pet adoption flyers, and after-school tuition ads for lost property notices, although he was only ever interested in the ones that offered a reward. If the reward was substantial enough, he would make contact with the owner and return the item. But more often than not, the proposed rewards failed to live up to his, admittedly, high expectations. Over the years, he had cultivated an extensive network of thrift stores, street vendors, and second-hand marketplaces that he did a steady stream of business with, and most of them, having a keen eye for the real value of things, paid much better than the insultingly low rewards people often placed for irreplaceable and sentimental items. Mark had been raised in a devoutly religious household, however, and still held on, although very loosely, to the values that had been instilled in him from an early age. So sometimes, although not very often, he would return the lost property to the owner, to save my wretched soul, as he so devoutly put it. It would have been a stretch to say that Mark took any kind of pride in his work. Pride was not something he had in abundance, and the little that he did hold on to was bruised beyond recognition. He saw no problem scrounging off the misfortunes of the rich or the poor, and he steadfastly refused to alter his expectations for either group. Value was value, and he had always seen himself as a businessman. As long as he was making money, he was happy. In the end, that's all that matters, right? He cared for nothing and nobody apart from himself and his money, which, when all accounted for,